It was a warm, sunny afternoon at Greenfield Park, a place where the air buzzed with laughter, joy, and the occasional bark of playful dogs. Families gathered around picnic tables, friends tossed frisbees across the open field, and children giggled as they chased bubbles floating on the breeze. Among the lively crowd was Amara, a bright and cheerful 16-year-old girl with a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the world. Amara had always been a beacon of positivity, even in the face of adversity. Born with a condition that left her dependent on a wheelchair, she never let her disability define her. Instead, she embraced life with a kind heart and a curious spirit. Greenfield Park was one of her favorite places, a sanctuary where she felt free to explore, connect with nature, and simply be herself. Today, like many others, she rolled along the winding paths, taking in the vibrant energy of the park. As she paused near the duck pond, feeding breadcrumbs to a flock of eager mallards, she hummed a tune her mother used to sing. Her radiant presence was hard to miss, and a few passers-by greeted her warmly. Amara loved these small interactions, moments that reminded her of the goodness in people. She cherished how this park seemed to bring everyone together, regardless of their differences. But not everyone shared Amara's optimistic view of the world. On the far side of the park, a uniformed police officer stood watching the crowd. Officer Daniels, a man in his early 40s with a stern demeanor, scanned the park with a sharp, critical gaze. His prejudices often dictated his actions, though he would never admit it out loud. When his eyes landed on Amara, something inside him shifted, a mix of suspicion and disdain. He began walking toward her, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. Amara didn't notice him at first, still lost in her own world of serenity. But as Officer Daniels approached, her instincts tingled. There was something about his presence, a coldness, a tension in the air, that unsettled her. She turned her head slightly, catching his shadow as it loomed over her. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his tone firm but devoid of warmth. And just like that, the peaceful afternoon began to unravel. "Can I help you, officer?" Amara asked, her voice calm but tinged with unease. She gripped the edges of her wheelchair tightly, her heart pounding as she faced the stern man standing before her. Officer Daniels crossed his arms and looked her up and down, his gaze settling on the wheelchair. "You look like you're just loitering here," he said curtly. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Amara blinked, confused. "Loitering? I'm just here enjoying the park like everyone else," she said, gesturing to the families, joggers, and picnickers around her. "Sure you are," Daniels said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You know, people like you often find ways to cause trouble. And judging by the way you're sitting there," he added, eyeing her wheelchair dismissively, "I'm not sure you belong here at all." Amara's cheeks burned. She'd heard comments like this before, but they never stopped stinging. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, officer." Daniels smirked, a condescending expression that made her blood boil. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, leaning closer. "And that fancy chair of yours? It's taking up space on the path. You're in the way." The accusation felt as absurd as it was cruel. Amara glanced around, noting the wide, open path behind her. There was plenty of room for anyone to pass, and yet this man seemed determined to single her out. "Sir, I'm not in anyone's way," she said firmly, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "I'm just sitting here by the pond." Daniels snorted. "Don't get smart with me, kid. I'm asking you to move." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the raised voices. Amara could feel their eyes on her, some filled with curiosity, others with sympathy. She hated being the center of attention like this, but she knew she couldn't let herself be intimidated. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is a public park." Daniel's face darkened. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make a few onlookers flinch. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Amara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Daniels reached down and grabbed the armrest of her wheelchair. "If you won't move, I'll make sure you're not in the way anymore." "Wait! Stop!" Amara shouted, panic rising in her chest as she tried to pull away. But Daniels was relentless. With a rough tug, he wrenched the armrest, breaking it clean off. The sound of snapping plastic echoed in the stunned silence of the crowd. The world seemed to freeze. Amara stared at the broken piece of her wheelchair in Daniel's hand, disbelief and anger swirling within her. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice cracking. Daniels didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the armrest onto the ground as if it were trash, brushing his hands off. "Now you're not in the way," he said coldly, turning to walk away as though the matter were settled. But it wasn't. The crowd, which had grown larger, erupted in whispers and murmurs. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Amara could hear snippets of their conversations. "Did he really just do that? This is unbelievable. Someone needs to stop him." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but Amara refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she focused on her breathing, steadying herself as she tried to process what had just happened. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions. Anger, humiliation, and frustration warred with her usual optimism. How could someone treat her this way, like she was less than human, and in front of so many people? Yet even in the midst of her turmoil, a small voice inside her reminded her of who she was. She was Amara, strong, resilient, and unbreakable, no matter what anyone else thought. "I can't believe this," she said softly. Her words meant more for herself than anyone else. But someone heard her. "It's not okay," a voice from the crowd said. Amara looked up to see a middle-aged woman stepping forward, her phone still recording. "What he did was wrong. Don't let him get away with this." The woman's words ignited something in Amara. She straightened her posture, meeting Daniels's gaze as he turned back to see what the commotion was about. "You think you can just break my wheelchair and walk away?" she called out, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You're going to regret this." Daniels hesitated, his confidence faltering as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Amara's words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. The crowd buzzed with tension, a mixture of anger and disbelief filling the air. Phones were raised, recording every second of the incident as the cops stood rigid under their collective scrutiny. Amara, despite her shaken state, held her ground, her eyes locked on the man who had just destroyed her wheelchair. Before anyone could take further action, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the murmurs. From across the park, a tall man in a sharp navy blue suit appeared, his presence commanding attention. His expression, calm yet intense, radiated authority. He was Amara's father, Senator David Carter, a prominent advocate for disability rights and racial equality. "Amara!" he called, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. Relief flooded her face as she turned to see him. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Senator Carter's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the broken wheelchair, the crowd, and the police officer standing at the center of it all. His jaw tightened, but his composure remained intact as he approached his daughter. Kneeling beside her, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Amara nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm fine, but—" "He broke my wheelchair," she said, gesturing toward the officer. Senator Carter straightened, turning his full attention to Officer Daniels. His piercing gaze made the officer shift uncomfortably. "You're the one responsible for this?" the senator asked, his tone measured but firm. Daniels hesitated, glancing at the crowd that was now squarely against him. She was obstructing the path, he mumbled defensively. I was just doing my job. Obstructing the path? Senator Carter repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. This path is wide enough for a car to pass through, let alone a wheelchair. And since when does your job include destroying someone's mobility aid? The officer opened his mouth to respond, but faltered under the senator's intense stare. I didn't mean for it to escalate, Daniels stammered. She was being uncooperative. Uncooperative? Senator Carter's voice rose slightly, the calm veneer cracking to reveal his outrage. My daughter was sitting peacefully in a public park. She wasn't breaking any laws, and she certainly wasn't interfering with your duties. What you've done here is not just unprofessional, it's an abuse of power. The crowd murmured their agreement, emboldened by the senator's words. A few people stepped forward, recounting what they had witnessed. I saw everything, one woman said, holding her phone up. She wasn't doing anything wrong. He harassed her out of nowhere. Yeah, a young man chimed in. And then he broke her wheelchair for no reason. It was disgusting. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The weight of the crowd's judgment and the senator's unwavering presence began to press down on him. He glanced at the phones recording him, realizing how damning the footage would be. Senator Carter took a step closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over the officer. You may not realize it, but the person you just humiliated is more than just my daughter. She's a young woman who has faced more challenges in her life than you could possibly imagine. And yet, she faces each day with courage and grace, qualities you seem to lack. Daniels looked away, his earlier arrogance replaced by a growing sense of shame. I didn't know she was your daughter, he muttered, as if that fact alone absolved him. The senator's eyes narrowed. Her relationship to me shouldn't matter, he said sharply. You should treat every person with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's the oath you took as an officer of the law. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, their support for the senator evident. Amara watched the scene unfold, a mix of gratitude and pride swelling in her chest. Despite her shaken state, she couldn't help but admire her father's ability to command respect and hold people accountable. Daniels, visibly rattled, looked at Amara for the first time since the confrontation began. For a moment, he saw past the wheelchair and the accusations. He saw a young girl who had been hurt, both physically and emotionally, by his actions. The regret in his eyes was unmistakable. I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have treated you that way. Amara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. You didn't just break my wheelchair, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. You made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't human. That's something no one deserves. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Daniels nodded slowly, his face pale. I'm sorry, he said, though the words felt hollow in the face of what he had done. Senator Carter turned to the crowd, addressing them as much as the officer. This isn't just about one incident, he said. It's about a pattern of behavior that we, as a society, need to confront. Racism, ableism, prejudice of any kind. It has no place in our communities, and it's up to all of us to stand against it. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their collective energy shifting from anger to hope. Amara smiled faintly, feeling the support of the people around her. As the noise subsided, the senator fixed Daniels with a stern look. You will be held accountable for your actions, he said firmly. I'll make sure of it. Daniels nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. The senator then turned back to Amara, kneeling beside her once more. Let's get you a new wheelchair, he said gently, his voice filled with warmth. "And let's make sure this never happens to anyone else." Amara nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming love and support she felt. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. As the senator helped her up, the crowd parted to let them through, their expressions a mixture of admiration and respect. The incident had been a painful reminder of the prejudice that still existed, but it had also sparked a moment of unity and resolve. And for Amara, it was a turning point, proof that even in the face of injustice, standing strong could inspire change. The videos recorded by the crowd spread like wildfire, making their way to social media platforms within hours. The footage of Officer Daniels breaking Amara's wheelchair and her father's powerful confrontation quickly went viral, sparking outrage across the community and beyond. Calls for accountability grew louder with every passing hour. The very next day, the local police department issued a public statement acknowledging the incident. The chief of police, a stoic yet empathetic figure, held a press conference to address the matter. "We are aware of the actions of Officer Daniels at Greenfield Park," he began, his voice grave. "His behavior does not reflect the values of our department or our commitment to serving all members of our community with dignity and respect. Effective immediately, Officer Daniels has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." The announcement marked the first step toward justice, but for many it wasn't enough. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "End racism and ableism now." The momentum grew, with community leaders organizing forums and discussions about how to combat discrimination in their city. Amara watched it all unfold from her living room, her new wheelchair parked beside her. Her father had wasted no time replacing the broken one, ensuring she could regain her mobility as quickly as possible. As she scrolled through the countless messages of support on social media, she felt a mixture of emotions, gratitude for the kindness of strangers, but also a lingering sadness over the experience she had endured. Later that evening, her father joined her on the couch. "You've sparked something powerful, Amara," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "People are finally having conversations about issues they've ignored for too long. You should be proud." Amara nodded thoughtfully. "I am, but I can't stop thinking about him." "Officer Daniels," she admitted. "I wonder if he regrets what he did, or if he's just upset he got caught." Senator Carter studied her face for a moment. "Regret is a complicated thing," he said. "Sometimes it takes a person being held accountable to truly reflect on their actions. But forgiveness, real forgiveness, that's even more powerful. It's not about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from anger." Amara considered her father's words, feeling their weight sink in. "I don't want to carry anger," she said finally. "I want to show him and everyone that humanity is stronger than hate." The following week, Amara's opportunity came. The police department arranged a formal meeting between her family and Officer Daniels as part of a restorative justice program. Amara wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she needed to face him one more time. When Daniels entered the room, he looked markedly different. The arrogance and coldness that had defined him during their first encounter were gone, replaced by a subdued demeanor. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated you in a way that was unacceptable. I'm deeply sorry for what I did." Amara studied him carefully, searching for sincerity in his words. She saw it, not just in his tone, but in the way he held himself, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his guilt. Taking a deep breath, she replied, "I accept your apology." Daniels looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You do? Yes, Amara said firmly. But accepting your apology doesn't mean I've forgotten what you did. It means I want to believe you can be better. That's what forgiveness is about, not erasing what happened, but choosing to move forward. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a quiet power. Even her father, who had been prepared to deliver another stern lecture, remained silent, watching his daughter with pride. Daniels nodded, his throat working as he tried to respond. I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said finally, but I promise I'll spend every day proving I'm worthy of it. The meeting ended on a solemn note, with Daniels leaving the room a humbled man. Amara felt a strange sense of relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Forgiving him hadn't erased the pain of what she'd experienced, but it had given her the strength to reclaim her own story. In the weeks that followed, the community continued to rally behind Amara. Local businesses organized fundraisers to support organizations that advocated for disability rights and racial equality. Schools introduced new programs to educate students about diversity and inclusion. Amara became a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring people to stand up against discrimination in all its forms. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Amara stayed true to herself, quiet, thoughtful, and kind. She often reflected on the day at Greenfield Park, not with bitterness, but with a sense of purpose. It wasn't just a painful memory. It was a turning point, a catalyst for change. One afternoon, she and her father returned to the park. As they strolled along the familiar paths, they noticed a plaque mounted on a bench near the duck pond. It read, "In honor of Amara Carter, a voice for justice, a beacon of hope." Amara's eyes filled with tears as she read the inscription. "I didn't expect this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've made a difference, Amara, and this is just the beginning." As they sat on the bench, watching the ducks glide across the water, Amara felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced adversity and come out stronger, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in a brighter, more just world. In the months following the incident, Senator David Carter took swift action. Using his platform and influence, he introduced a comprehensive bill aimed at addressing systemic racism and promoting accessibility for disabled individuals. The proposed legislation included stricter oversight of law enforcement practices, mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, and increased funding for public spaces to ensure they were accessible to all. The bill, titled the Amara Act, was a direct response to the events at Greenfield Park and symbolized a commitment to creating a more inclusive and equitable society. During a press conference to announce the bill, Senator Carter stood beside Amara, who had become a symbol of resilience and hope for many. Cameras flashed as she spoke, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "What happened to me that day wasn't just about one person's prejudice. It was a reflection of the barriers and biases that so many people face every day," she said. "But we can change that. It starts with empathy, with understanding, and with holding ourselves accountable for how we treat one another." Her words resonated with millions. The press coverage of the event further amplified the importance of the legislation, sparking a national conversation about the intersections of racism and ableism. Communities across the country began organizing their own initiatives, inspired by Amara's courage and determination. For Amara, the journey was both humbling and transformative. She often reflected on how a single moment of injustice had ignited such widespread action. Despite the challenges she had faced, she chose to focus on the positive change that had emerged from the experience. "Hate only wins if we let it divide us," she said during an interview. "But when we respond with kindness and strength, we create something powerful, something that can't be broken." In the meantime, Greenfield Park became a symbol of healing and progress. The local government installed new accessibility features throughout the park, including wider paths, ramps, and benches designed to accommodate people with disabilities. A mural was painted near the duck pond, depicting a diverse group of people standing together under the words, "Stronger Together." One sunny afternoon, Amara returned to the park with her father. Her new wheelchair gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol not just of mobility, but of her resilience. As they strolled along the now familiar paths, people stopped to greet her, thanking her for her bravery and sharing how her story had inspired them. Near the duck pond, a group of children played, their laughter echoing across the water. Amara watched them with a soft smile, remembering how this place had once been the site of her pain, but had now transformed into a space of hope and unity. Her father joined her on a nearby bench, and they sat in companionable silence, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park, Amara turned to her father. "Do you think people will really change?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. Senator Carter smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They already are, Amara," he replied. "Change doesn't happen all at once, but it starts with people like you, people brave enough to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' And it spreads, one act of kindness, one moment of understanding at a time." Amara nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth it. As the park buzzed with life around her, she realized that her story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a movement built on compassion, courage, and the unwavering belief that a better world was possible. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of her community, Amara smiled, knowing that she had made a difference.